Hello, this is Gene Rice, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Fort Hays State University, coming to you from Hays, Kansas, with the third of 3 video lectures on communitarianism. The title of this third lecture is Communitarianism, Asian Values and Human Rights. What we're going to do, as is been our protocol here recently, we're going to do a little bit of review, and then we'll move on to the topic of the day. We're going to review first a little bit about communitarianism and then about Asian values, and then talk specifically about how we might define human rights in terms of their fundamental elements or features, and then how this plays out in the larger debate between Western liberal countries and those who do not endorse traditional Western liberalism. And so we'll see that for better or for worse, most of what we have politically to this point are still a lot of questions. And there aren't a lot of answers to some of these questions. There are a lot of very difficult issues, but also very relevant and very timely issues. Issues that people who are involved in politics and in lots of other areas will need to work out the ethical and political answers to a lot of these very hard questions. So in a certain respect, a very important and very timely topic for today. So let's begin with a little bit of review. Communitarianism, recall, was a philosophical movement and a movement which arose out of political challenges, both internal and external. And part of the communitarian movement was or is known as the Asian values debate. And so we'll just review here a little bit. The Asian values debate was a movement that started in Singapore and Japan and China and other places in Asia, although of course it's not necessarily limited to Asian countries, but it was a movement that attempted to draw some arguments against the individualism and the liberalism and the neutrality, which are the hallmarks of Western political theory. So the most important ideas in the Asian values movement then are what I have already discussed with you a little bit before these 5 you have in front of you now. The emphasis on the traditional family and the value of familial loyalty to your family. Second, excellence in academic and technological pursuits. Third, thriftiness as a core value and hard work. Thriftiness there, of course, would be in direct opposition to the kind of consumerism that many communitarians criticize modern Western cultures for. Fourth, sacrificing individual freedoms for the good of the family, the corporation, or the society. And last but not least, the Asian values movement emphasizes the importance of recognizing the fact that humans are born into social networks, families, and cultures, and of course that is where we will find our best life and our happiest life. Okay, one more little bit of review here, and that was just to call to mind the distinction between internal and external challenges. And to point out that, remember, internal challenges were challenges which arose, political problems which arose within liberal societies. People who lived in those societies experienced certain things which seem to suggest that the liberal approach was not the best approach or needed to be at least changed in some sense. Then we also had these external challenges where you had liberal cultures coming into contact with non-liberal cultures in various ways, sometimes peaceful and sometimes not so peaceful. And so there were political challenges which arose in that context as well. The Asian values debate has really come to be enshrined in the language of human rights. And in fact, almost all international political debate is phrased or couched in the language of human rights. And it's really hard to overestimate the importance of human rights in international politics today. And so if we think of the problems and the issues which arise when cultures clash or cultures come together to try and work out their problems, much of that debate, much of the consulting and the arguing back and forth comes to be described in human rights language that uses this idea of human rights. And so we're going to talk then about this and to talk about what it might mean in the long run. So some of these challenges we'll talk a little more directly about, and some of them we'll just point in the direction or gesture in the direction of answers and important ideas which come up. So, are there really any universal human rights, that is, human rights that apply to all cultures and all people? Should all countries accept rights? Should they accept the same lists of rights? Is democracy necessary for upholding human rights? Should all countries be democratic? Democratic in the same way? Are Western democracies or liberal societies like the United States really helping other cultures when they try to export human rights or democracies? And so these are just some of the many important external challenges, the questions which arise when liberal societies interact with other cultures. Okay. The notion of a human right and its origins are the next couple of items which we'll discuss here. On this slide we have a very famous, perhaps the most famous, quote about human rights, which comes from the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed shortly after the end of the Second World War. Article 1 says, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood." This article, as quoted here and quoted many other places, reflects this idea that human rights are universal moral rules or moral laws which apply to all people. They're not the rights of Europeans or the rights of South Americans or the rights of Africans. They're human rights. They're not women's rights. They're not the rights of children or something like that. They're just rights which apply to all human beings simply because they are human. And that quote has become, again, reflective of a movement or a growing importance of human rights in politics and international politics that in 60 or 70 years has been astounding. All right. If the idea of a human right is supposed to be universal, it is nonetheless the case that human rights arose out of the West. And so this early human rights development comes from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, from philosophers, Western philosophers like John Locke and Thomas Paine. They were often, at this time, called natural rights, and the philosophers would often tie these natural rights very closely to the English legal tradition, English law, and also to the Christian religion. And so these are some of the earliest references to the concept of a human right that we have. And of course, these are largely, if not entirely, developed within Western liberal political history. The next slide brings us up to the modern human rights era, which began at the end of the Second World War after the defeat of Japan and of Germany, and particularly as a response to the genocide that occurred in Germany against the Jewish people. There was a large and widespread attempt or feeling that something major had to change to prevent genocide and those sorts of horrific crimes. We call them crimes against humanity now. And so one result of the Second World War and of the atrocities of the Second World War was the development of this new push for human rights, not so much natural rights anymore, and as we'll see, less tied to Christianity. And since that time, there has been a continual expansion in the number of rights claimed. So there was the first United Nations Declaration, and there have been many others, and not only in the United Nations, of course, but in other regional political bodies, and also, of course, in particular states and in particular countries. There would have been, movements, other kinds of movements, which would have created more rights than the ones that are listed in the United Nations covenants themselves. It's hard to read any report about international politics without hearing the word human right or the word right. And it's become the kind of the default language of human rights and of international politics. And so no country in the world, now almost no country in the world, would ever say that they don't believe in human rights, or would say that their goal is to suppress human rights or something like that. And it is the case that nearly every country in every part of the world is a signatory to the United Nations, the various United Nations declarations on human rights. And so this begs a lot of questions, because, of course, not every country is probably doing as much as they can to promote human rights. And there are a lot of questions about what it means that so many countries claim to defend human rights or claim to believe in human rights when, as a political matter, we can see that these countries look very differently. And of course, on top of that, you have additional problems about whether liberal societies themselves, where these human rights are supposedly drawn from, whether we in the West take them seriously enough, or whether we simply pay them lip service, whether we don't take them seriously ourselves. So nonetheless, this development in human rights has meant that most of the debates about Asian values and about modern international politics have become couched in the language of human rights. They are expressed in the language of human rights. So let's give a definition. This is my definition that I have kind of put together in my own work on human rights. There are other definitions, but we'll stick with this one. And again, like communitarianism, it is a long and somewhat complicated definition that we'll try to make sense of as we go along here. A human right is a universal legal or moral norm that is accorded or given to all individuals in the world, right, in order to protect them from severe abuses via other individuals, groups, governments, government institutions, or even private corporations. So this definition recognizes that human rights apply to all people in the world, that they are meant primarily as a way of preventing severe abuses. Human rights are not meant, or were not originally meant, to make sure your life was great in every way, or make sure that you were the most moral person you could ever be. Rather, they were meant to protect against the worst kinds of abuses: genocide, murder, rape, torture, aggression, these sorts of horrible kinds of crimes. And lastly, that these severe abuses could come about from any number of different sources. Of course, they could come about from other countries, invading and causing crimes. They could come from your own government. Your own government could commit genocide against some of its citizens. And they could also come, of course, from other individuals, and they could come from corporations, businesses, and so forth. In the United States now, there's a very large and ongoing criminal lawsuit against some people who owned a mining company, and they were releasing chemicals, asbestos, into the air, and it was killing and sickening hundreds of people who lived nearby. And they knew all along that it was poisonous, but they pretended and told people otherwise. And so even corporations can violate human rights. Okay, so that's our basic definition. Let's go on now to talk about some of these elements in more detail. First off, human rights are claims of the highest order. They're the most important kinds of moral claims that can be made, precisely because they're protecting people against the worst kinds of violation. So lying to you may be immoral, but it's unlikely that I'm violating your human rights. If I assault you, however, if I beat you up, well, then I have violated your human right, because I'm taking something that's very important to what it is to be a human, namely your bodily security, your ability to control your own body. Second, human rights are independent of legal or political endorsement. This is sometimes confusing because we tend to think of human rights as being enforced, and this is probably something we want to spend a little bit of time on. Let's take the example of the human right to life. It's important to distinguish the human right from its legal protection. So, according to the United Nations Declaration, all human beings have a right to life. You cannot kill another person, or you create a grave injustice. But we also tend to associate that with a legal right. That is, specific laws that protect people and punish violators. All right? It's important to note that the human right has priority over the legal right or the what you might call the political institution which supports it. So in this case, maybe the police or the courts or the prisons. Everyone in every country that exists today supposedly has a human right to life. But they might live in a country where there isn't a statute that says it's wrong to kill them. So, for example, again, I'll use the United States. If you go back far enough in the United States, it was not illegal to beat up or to kill a person of black skin color. Right? nonetheless, when we look back at that, we say, well, that was a violation of their human right to life. In the Second World War, when Jews were killed in large numbers, there was no legal law that was violated. In fact, Hitler created laws to help foster the genocide. Nonetheless, we would say that those people who were killed and sentenced to labor camps, they had their rights violated. Okay? And also, it may be that some countries have the legal institution, have the legal rights. In other words, it's on the book that it's wrong to kill other people, even if they're Jewish or they have black skin color or whatever. But they may not have the support, the institutions needed to protect those rights. So it's very important to remember that although we always want the legal rights to be written down somewhere and we want the political institutions to support them, this comes first, right? The human right precedes these other elements of human rights. So, of course, it's never enough just to have or to say, oh, yes, we believe in human rights, but we don't really have any laws. In fact, our laws might contradict that, or we don't have the institutions to support it, right? So, and this is a big issue because, as I mentioned at the start, almost no country in the world will say that people don't have human rights. The question is, do they have the laws on the books, and do they have the institutions which will support that? And so that'll be part of our discussion here as we go ahead. The third item on the list of elements of human rights is just a reminder there that human rights are moral minimums. Again, human rights are not meant to make you the most charitable, happy, virtuous person in the world. They're just meant to protect you from really harming other people. And finally, fourth, human rights represent a fighting doctrine that is used to reform legal and political institutions. And so the human rights movement is much broader than just a legal movement or a political movement of a particular country. There are various non-government agencies like Amnesty International and other groups of people who have tried to reform legal and political institutions in all kinds of countries, both liberal and non-liberal, to make them more friendly towards human rights. Okay, this next slide then details some important basic kinds of rights, basic categories, types of human rights. The first are liberty rights, freedom of movement, association, freedom of thought, freedom of religion. The second are what are sometimes called security rights or rights to life, protections against murder, torture, assault, slavery, so forth. Third are due process rights. These are not necessarily rights that are written down so much as they are rights to legal standing, to fair trial, to protection against arbitrary arrest or laws that these are called ex post facto laws which you can't get punished for laws which were not laws at the time that you were doing your actions and so forth. So due process rights are important because they give people the right to have legal standing. A fourth kind of right are political rights, rights to participate in government, voting, assembly, and association. And lastly, there are item E, economic, sometimes called welfare rights, which are rights to property, rights to an education, health care, minimal standards of living, Some countries and some declarations say that people even have a right to paid holidays and a right to form trade unions. And there, as I mentioned at the start, there has been a lot of new and sometimes controversial rights added to the list. Group rights. So there are sometimes the rights of indigenous people, the rights of gay rights, the rights of homosexuals, so forth. Animal rights is another category, and even environmental rights, the rights of the environment. So we're going to ignore item F there for today because it's too far afield of our main topic. So if we look then at those rights, we could ask ourselves, or we should ask ourselves, because this is a political philosophy course, what justifies those rights? And there are many answers, as many answers as there are political theories that you have studied. And when we look at which rights there are, we are quickly led to ask the question, why are there rights in the first place? And so you could have a number of different theories. Even just if you limit yourself to the West, you would have a number of choices, including the ones that you have already studied up to this point: social contract theories, utilitarianism, natural law, various religious justifications for human rights, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and so forth. And then, of course, you could go into non-Western theories and see if they could justify human rights as well. Okay, so let's talk about kinds of rights and look at the possibilities here if we look at East and West. Again, we're using those terms very broadly, and by West we just mean Western liberal political tradition. Western liberalism tends to emphasize, not surprisingly, security rights and liberty rights and political rights. All right? Not so much economic rights, although this might be changing in some countries, and not every country is the same. Of course, in the United States, we do not have national health care. France and Canada and other places do. They see health care as an economic right. All right? The reason that liberty and security are so important, of course, is because in the Western liberal tradition, freedom is one of the most basic values, right? And so it makes sense then that liberty would be one of its most important rights. And in the Western tradition, usually these are the first and most important, and only later then would we come to economic rights, or further on down the line. What do non-Western countries or non-Western political systems say about kinds of rights? Well, there's a lot of answers here. If we go back to the slide, you'll see that you could identify probably many more than 4, but I've got 4 up there. 4 possibilities for Asian values, non-Western values, and human rights. Some countries who have signed the treaties and so forth see human rights as an ideal, a kind of future goal, maybe a very distant future, one that's not really realistic for their country to strive for right now. So you might think of many developing countries that don't really have stable governments or a lot of political or economic power, who would say, well, we're trying to get our country under control, and we can't really worry about human rights right now, but maybe in a later date. So they have signed the treaties, and they'll say they believe in human rights, but they see it more as a distant future goal. Another possibility again here in Eastern or simply non-liberal societies, some countries would accept the concept of a human right, but claim that other rights should come first. So here's where, again, we could have different priorities of lists. Again, if we're thinking very broadly, very generally, one approach would be to say, well, yes, human rights are very important, and we believe in human rights, but it's just that we're not going to have the same priority or the same list of human rights that maybe traditional Western liberal countries would. So, for example, Singapore would say, well, we're worried primarily about feeding our people and modernizing our country. And so the most important thing is that we improve our economic and our financial structure, and sometimes, giving people political or liberty rights will slow that down or will hurt that. And so we're going to focus on economic rights. And so this is one possible approach. And actually, this is one of the most common approaches that you'll see as a matter of political fact. Other countries will accept this list and this priority, and basically agree that, well, modern Western liberalism is not only right or not only correct to think that there are human rights, but that the ones that they have and the ones that they put first, security, liberty, and so forth, are the ones we're going to kind of promote. Off the top of my head, I'm not thinking of a lot of examples of this, but I'm sure they exist out there. And finally, then, would be countries who say, well, we don't believe that human rights really make sense in our country, and so they're going to reject the entire concept of a human right. Okay. We'll come back to that last possibility towards the end. Let's suppose for a second that a country believes in human rights and was going to try and explain or justify their priority, their listing of human rights. So, what could a non-Western, a non-liberal society do? Well, one thing they could do is just simply accept, right? Accept all the values and all the human rights that Western liberalism accepts. So they would accept individualism and the value of freedom and state neutrality. And all of that would kind of play out politically in accepting human rights. Right? So this would be essentially a non-Western approach, would essentially accept all of the values that Western liberalism accepts, right? Again, that's probably not the most common approach, even though they've all signed, even though non-Western countries, as well as Western countries, have all signed the same list of covenants from the United Nations. A second approach would be what you might call the overlapping consensus approach. See HR here, it's not real clear, but HR means human rights, right? So they would agree that there are such human rights, but they would try to explain how human rights arise out of or are justified from their own traditional values, right? So it might come out of a Confucian or a Buddhist religion or something like that, or some other group of values which they believe would allow them to talk about and to justify human rights. So both systems, A and B, overlap on the issue of human rights. But they do so for different reasons, if that makes sense. Sorry, my chart is going sideways here. Right? So they would agree on human rights, or at least on the idea of human rights, but they would do so for different values. Their values are not exactly the same. They don't completely overlap. And then a third possibility is just that they would include some values as being shared, but not all of them. Right? So in that quote from Lee Kuan Yew, he suggested that true freedom comes from having an ordered society. And so he might argue, or someone from his position might argue, that freedom is something that the non-Western society accepts, and it comes to amount to the same thing, and also promotes human rights in basically the same way. But there are also some other traditional values or situations which might limit the agreement between the two cultures. Okay, let's move on then. Those are three ways to identify or to justify human rights and various rankings of human rights. Let's move on to talk then finally about human values, or Asian values, and democracy. We've been talking about human rights here, and you can have a kind of similar debate on the issue of democracy. And it's, again, you see very similar lines being drawn on each side about whether or not democracy is necessary for human rights, whether or not Western societies should embrace democracy, and so forth. And so again, I'm not going to we don't have time to go into this in great detail, and you may be doing some readings outside of this presentation on democracy, but nonetheless, we'll mention a few questions here for further study. First, is democracy universally valid? Or is it relative to human political values and tradition? So we just asked that question about human rights. Are human rights universally valid? Or are they limited to the Western political system? Do human rights make sense in non-Western countries? And we could ask the same question about democracy, right? And we are asking the same question about democracy, for example, in the Middle East, where in Afghanistan and in Iraq, the United States is very heavily involved in military, political, and social and economic advances where we're trying to bring about basically democracy and in some cases human rights. And so the question is, Does it make sense? Are we doing the right thing? Is the United States and its allies helping those people, really? Or are we forcing our values and our way of doing things on people who do not share our history and our culture and our values? So it's a very timely question, very important one. A related one is whether or not democracy is required to implement human rights. So you could take almost any country in the world that is not democratic, and they will say that they believe in human rights, but that they do not necessarily believe in democracy. And so in the West, philosophers and politicians and even ordinary citizens tend to believe that it doesn't make sense to have support for human rights and not have democracy. So that's an important question. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is the whole question of which we began this lecture and some of the previous lectures on communitarianism. How is it that modern liberal cultures should engage other modern non-liberal cultures? And the relationship between the modern West and China is but one example of many where we have a crucially important relationship, lots of opportunities and lots of challenges for both sides, for liberal cultures and for Asian and non-liberal cultures, to try and decide and answer these questions about human rights, about the value of community and the relationship of the individual to the community, and of course, finally, about our own moral values and how we relate to people who are different than us. So globalization has, for better or for worse, sort of forced this on us, and of course, a lot of other factors as well. But we're living in a world where it doesn't seem like we'll ever be going back the other direction. And so we have it as our moral challenge and a responsibility to engage each other in respectful discourse and to see where we agree and where we disagree and where we can solve some problems. So again, there's a lot of questions, more so than answers, but that's the nature of the debate as it stands now, and I wish you the best of luck in coming to some answers for your own self and for your own community and your own country.